New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the world's philosophies. With me is Dr. Huston Smith, one of the world's great authorities on philosophy and religion. Dr. Smith is a professor emeritus in philosophy and religion at Syracuse University. He's also taught at MIT and at the University of California at Berkeley. He is the author of the classic book, The Religions of Man, which has been republished as The World's Religions. He is also the author of The Forgotten Truth, The Primordial Tradition, and Beyond the Postmodern Mind. Welcome, Huston.
It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Likewise.
When we think of something as broad a subject as the world's philosophies, it seems that perhaps we can best look at it in a global or a geographic sense and begin to notice how the geographical features of the different regions of the world have contributed to the fundamental religious and philosophical outlooks of those regions.
Well, I like that approach. In one sense, just as the world is one globe, philosophy is one endeavor in the sense that it tries to make sense out of life and existence. But it is true that peoples are not carbon copies of one another. And these philosophies are spread over the world, and just as you mentioned that the geographical regions differ, so the philosophies that have come out of these regions are also different in a very instructive way, I think.
Mm-hmm. You've written that there are three fundamental, enduring philosophical traditions that have developed on the planet.
That is true. There are three great enduring civilizations. These are the Western civilizations, which includes religiously the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also Western philosophy. And then there is the South Asian tradition, which stems from India, includes Sri Lanka. And then there's, thirdly, the East Asian tradition, centering in China, but from China, it radiated to Japan, Korea, aspects of Southeast Asia, and Tibet. Mm-hmm. Now, I find that it is very interesting to match up these three great enduring philosophies that have come out of these three regions with the three inescapable problems of human life, which Bertrand Russell once listed. It's not unique to him, that everywhere the people live, they are confronted with first the problem of nature, how to wring their livelihood out of the natural world. Second, the problem of human relationships, how do they get along with one another? And third, how do we get along with ourselves? We can think of these as the natural, the social, and the psychological problem. Now, in relating these to the world's philosophies, the hypothesis that I think we get most mileage out of in terms of illumination is to think of these three philosophical traditions, each one as having accented, so to speak, or specialized on one of these three inescapable problems. Specifically, we in the West seem to have paid more attention to the natural world, to nature, than have the other two. Just in passing, the fact that modern science emerged in the West is one very strong evidence of that fact. East Asia appears to have focused more on human relationships, the social question, and has become, by virtue of that, in its historical period, the world's great social philosopher. The fact that Confucianism, even today, people, historians, sinologists, can't make up their minds whether Confucianism is a religion or an ethic, because the social aspect is so strong. And then finally, India appears to have concentrated more intently than either of the other two on the psychological question. Who are we? What is our psychological makeup? And has become, by virtue of that emphasis, the world's great introspective psychologist.
Now, Huston, you yourself spent your youth in China.
True.
And I think you have some interesting first-hand observations about the relationship of the Chinese people to nature itself, particularly the rivers that would flood. You lived near one such flood, as I recall.
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons why the Chinese philosophies did not go as deeply into nature as did the Western is that the natural environment was much less hospitable. For one thing, all but 14%, 86% of China is Rocky Mountains. It's not tillable, and you can't do anything with that. But as you mentioned, I think that the rivers played an even more important part, because China's rivers are unlike those of India or of the West. They originate in the western mountain regions where the soil is of a special consistency that causes it to wash very badly, and the riverbeds build up. So the floods, the rivers of China, they've been called China's scourge. And you mentioned my own relation. It's true, a boy living only 12 miles from the Yangtze during the catastrophic floods of 1932, in which over 1 million people were drowned. Nobody knows how many million died of ensuing famine. So nature was daunting to the Chinese mind. Now, there is a naturalism in Far Eastern thought, but it's the naturalism of the artist and the nature lover and the poet, of the Wordsworth and the Thoreau, not the naturalism of the Galileo and Bacon, where we really get in there and work with it.
I think it's fair to say that since we're talking in the broadest sense about civilizations and planetary philosophies, naturally there'll be many exceptions to the currents of thought that you're trying to draw out, but Taoism is a Chinese philosophy that emphasized nature, but I suppose it's important to say that Taoism, while very important in China's history, never became the dominant philosophy as did Confucianism.
Well, that's true, but even more important is that the Taoist approach to nature is that of the nature lover and the poet and the artist, not that of the scientist. In fact, I remember one of the chapters in the Tao Te Ching speaks very directly to that. It says, those who would take over the earth and mold it to their ways never, I notice, succeed. The earth is like a sacred vessel, so exalted that they reach out their hands and it is gone. See, it's an awe of nature, but not a pragmatic approach to rearranging the balance between the human species and nature.
In the Western religious and philosophical systems, there was more of a sense of distance from nature. We could set ourselves apart, we could observe it and manipulate it.
Very true, very true. And that holds also not only for matter, but also for the other components of nature, which are time and space. It's an evidence of the Western preoccupation with nature that three great concepts emerged in the West and the West only. One is science, as we've mentioned, and that relates to matter, scrutinizing matter and working with it. But the second is the idea of progress. Now, progress relates to time, which again is another component of nature. And the fact that the idea of historical progress arose in the West and in the West only is again one more evidence of its preoccupation with the nature. The other matrix of nature is space. And the Western civilization has had far more space to work with. And there is the adage of the space of the frontier, lots of space, being the breeding ground of individualism. So the third great discovery of the West is that of the individual and his or her rights. So all three of these original discoveries of the West derive from an intense preoccupation with the structure of nature.
Now, many of us in the West today probably would experience our culture as having a very rich psychology and sociology going back over 100 years, and yet you would maintain that the psychological arts and sciences were much more highly developed in the Indian subcontinent, and that the social relations and sociology was much more highly developed in China. How can that be?
Well, look at the evidence. As you say, we're talking about in very broad strokes, but let's begin with psychology. Jung himself said,
Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist,
that when we think of India, its psychological methods and doctrines, they put us in the West to shame. Here is a Western psychologist. If we go back, look at terminology, Kumaraswamy, a great student of Oriental art, he said for every psychological term in English, there are 4 in Greek and 40 in Sanskrit. Classical Abhidhamma philosophy of Buddhism distinguishes no fewer than 121 distinct states of consciousness. It's matters like that lead me to say that India has focused on that aspect with an intensity and single-mindedness almost that we have not. I can be anecdotal. I was anecdotal about China. I'll be anecdotal for a moment about Indian psychology. I find myself in the bizarre situation of being on the editorial board of 3 journals of psychology. Now, objectively, this makes no sense at all. I'm not a psychologist. Truth to tell, I can't even remember if I ever had a course in psychology. Why am I on it? Because these are all journals, and granted they're not mainstream journals, Journal of Humanistic Psychologists, of Transpersonal Psychology and Psychosynthesis, but nevertheless having subscriptions of over 10,000 in each, so they're not insignificant, and all of them sense that there is something in Asian and specifically Eastern psychology that we in the West have not caught up with. Gordon Allport, while I was at MIT and he was at Harvard, had me come over to meet with one of his seminars in psychology, and he summarized it after I had given a talk on the 4 yogas. He laughed and said, in the West, well, no, the 4 aims of life in Indian psychology: pleasure, success, retirement, and renunciation. He said, in the West, we have a huge and very well worked out psychology of success in achievement motivation,
Yes.
McClellan's
Yes.
of that. When it comes to, pleasure, we have Freud in the pleasure principle, and then we have McClellan on success in achievement motivation. When we come to the retirement and human fulfillment, and where morality comes in, I remember his phrase, we have a nickel's worth of Freud's superego, and that's about it when we come to the higher reaches
Yes.
of the mind and the self in the West.
Now, I might add to that and say we do have Carl Jung in his psychology too, but these are all very recent developments.
Exactly, and it was not until the last century, 19th century, that the unconscious mind came into view as a fully accepted reality. Well, one's tempted to say better late than never, but the point is that India had been working with that notion of unconscious regions of the mind for over 2,500 years.
Well, one of the things that you have argued, I believe, is that in the Indian subcontinent, the climate and social conditions were so bad that the philosophers felt our only hope for salvation was to turn inward.
Well, I mentioned a little earlier that in China, the geography and geological facts were daunting to the prospect of working constructively and pragmatically with nature. In India, we can say that not only was nature daunting, different from China, basically fierce and sharp extremes, 10 months of aridity, and then the monsoons come slamming in, turn the continent into a sea of mud. But in China, the social frontier looked promising, because they were of the same racial stock, black-haired sons of Han and so on. Whereas in India, India was conquered in the 2nd millennium BC by Aryans, basically European in types, whereas the indigenous population was Dravidian and Negroid. So right off, she was confronted with the most devilish of all social problems of a heavy color culture barrier. Caste was introduced to try to solve the problem, but it bogged down. The problem took over the caste. So in India, you have an inhospitable nature. You have a devilish social problem. What's left? The self. If only we could figure out who we truly are, might we not then win through to a freedom that transcends the opposites, the block, both nature and society? And that's the route that India took.
Now, why not in China? Wouldn't they also explore the psychological depths?
Well, that's that's a good question, and I think my answer may not be a strong one, but they no, I'll take that back. I think it is a strong one, and I think we do have evidence. It goes back again to nature, because those rivers would change course overnight, and very early we have records of massive organizational projects for dike building and canal networks to drain the water off from the massive, what would otherwise be massive floods. numbering up to 10,000, even 100,000 human beings organized way back. We're talking about BC, before the Common Era now. And so you might say they had to learn how to work together, and we see evidences of that coming out today. In 30 years, the Chinese, I'm quoting a Scientific American article of September 1980, which the first sentence was, in 30 years, a fourth of the human race appears to have put destitution and epidemic disease permanently behind them. Period. The second sentence, this is a world historical achievement. Recently, the population statisticians have been amazed. China cut its birth rate 50% in 10 years. Now, granted, this kind of effectiveness has a certain price tag attached to it, so I'm not saying that it's always good, but I am saying it's evident that they seem to know how to get things done on a mass scale.
But does this have to be at the expense of an introspective skill or cultivating states of liberation or individuality?
I think, all things considered, it's not required, but it's almost like nothing fails like success. They were so successful on the social front that they didn't really feel a lack in the other, but they did actually recognize it when Buddhism came in. The Chinese have always been a very proud people, but when Buddhism came along, they accepted it, recognizing that it has something, and I'm talking now about their psychological depth, as well as some metaphysical speculation that the Chinese realized they were not very good at, and they took over, and actually Confucianism molded itself in Neo-Confucianism to accepting these Indian ideas of the self, and Neo-Confucianism does begin to grow more psychological than the early, but due to India's irradiation.
Yes. Well, of course, it's often been said that India is the source of all wisdom.
Well, you see, I would say the wisdom has
these three components.
Components, and I do think that they have been stellar and have outdistanced the other two in their psychological knowledge.
Now, let us return to the West again. Obviously, we have enormous scientific achievements. Are you saying that the principle that nothing fails like success applies here, and this is why we haven't developed our psychological depths or our social relations to the extent that the other civilizations have? I
would say that, and I would say comparably about the other two, that their defects are in different areas. But I think it is true. Psychologically, if we look at ourselves in long historical perspective, we have been sort of undistinguished. There are brilliant insights in the Psalms, in St. Augustine, in Pascal, in the Russian novelist Dostoevsky and the like. But the interesting thing is they never coalesce into a solid body of psychological knowledge. It's a little bit like China in the case of science. The most brilliant individual discoveries, gunpowder, paper, and other things, and wine, and things like brilliant, but they never push ahead with it for a developing organic field of knowledge. And I think psychology today in the West it's at loggerheads. We have experimental on the one hand, and then we have depth on the other, but we have no coherent view of the human self.
Well, and I'm sure virtually all psychologists would agree that we have yet to sustain coherence in that discipline. But we're in an interesting period now. This is an age of diversity and global cultural synthesis. Perhaps we have the potential to move beyond the historical limitations that you have pointed out.
Well, that's exactly what I hope, that we can listen carefully enough to each of these civilizations to glean from them the best that their concerted efforts have brought to light. And then, as you were saying, hopefully, some way, it's not easy to see how, but the hope is that they can be melded into a civilization which will take all three of these issues with equal seriousness.
Mm-hmm. In other words, perhaps the emerging philosophy and religion and civilization of the future will have the depth of the spirit of India and the strength of social coherence we see in China, and the individuality and scientific understanding and progress of the West, all wrapped into one.
Let it be. Let it be.
Might there not be some downfall to all of this? Have we forgotten something? I'm, for example, a concern for the environment.
Well, of course, that is the towering point. And here, I think we really cannot look to the past, because this is a genuinely new issue. And it may be at the rate the human population is proliferating, and the toxic, just this last week received a letter from Hoffman, who invented the LSD, and a chapter of his book is exactly on this, on the toxic way. He's a chemist. Mm-hmm. And these two factors may just make this the towering issue of everybody, and the other issues may have to fit in under that umbrella.
Huston Smith, it has been a joy spending this last half hour with you,
Thank you,
reviewing the civilizations, the philosophies, and the religious traditions of the entire globe.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for being with me.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.